Go ahead and get started. First off, I just want to thank all of you for just being here. This is such an important topic for our industry, and yet there's so much that we have to learn. The fact that you just simply made it here speaks to your leadership in the field and your commitment to impact. So thank you for being here today. It is no simple task to try to understand equitable development or how to uplift communities out of poverty. And the inspiring thing is that we have people representing over 20 states across the country on this call. Each of us are lucky enough to be in this work, to be able to do community development. And despite the fires on the West Coast, the hurricanes in the Gulf South, and even a global pandemic, we are all very lucky to just simply be doing this work. These deals are complex, they're difficult. And I think as the industry is maturing and we're getting better at getting the deal done, now we're turning to impact. And our hope is that we can leverage the incredible speakers today and this community to understand how do we really measure equitable outcomes of these tax credits, which in the end were their intended purpose to lift up low-income communities around the country. So I'm excited to help bring the speakers together today, and I know you're going to really enjoy what they have to say. So Dr. Carter, thanks for leading us forward.
Good afternoon, everyone. What we wanted to do today was to start our discussion with a baseline. And when we think about racism, often we think about it in the context of person to person, but often it is rooted in geography. Just to remind us that oftentimes in our environments, there's a tale of two cities that are present. And oftentimes just beyond the bridge, there's a totally different environment than the one we may be familiar with. And so when we think about racism, when we think about new market tax credits, when we think about equity and equitable development, we have to begin to think about the place in which those things occur and how racism has been tied to locations and been allowed to and encouraged to continue over the years. So when we talk about race or racism, it's important to keep a few things in mind. One is thinking about context. So racism can happen between several different races. Often the one that is in discussion, it is impacting Black Americans or Americans with Latinx backgrounds. And so when we think about the racial context of why that happened and the history of America and how labor was free, when that labor was liberated, how there was tension between those who used to receive that labor for free and those who were required to give that labor. And so thinking about that history, thinking about the context in the cities that we're in, whether that's in the southern portion of the United States or northern portion, and how the history of the place plays a part. It's all things that we need to consider as we begin to implement solutions that can help to move us forward. And the who. So when we think again about racism, often it's person to person. But what I want to talk about today is how systemic racism, or racism that is embedded in systems and institutions, why that is such a dominant determining factor in the outcome of communities. And so when we think about the who, when we examine its impact, how it's incorporated policies, and we'll hear that more throughout the presentation, it also underscores who the who needs to be today when we think about solutions. And as we discuss the context in the next few slides, we'll also see some lingering effects, how these actions just didn't happen 100 years ago, 50 years ago. They're still in place today and have been even more exacerbated by our current conditions with COVID-19. So this quote, and I will read it because when I first heard it, I was very surprised. But it says, the infiltration of inharmonious racial groups tend to lower the levels of land values and to lessen the desirability of residential areas. Now, if this was just a personal opinion, that would be one thing. But this was a policy that was pulled directly from the manual that the Federal Housing Administration used to support their decisions on whether or not they would issue loans or back loans or encourage development in certain communities. And so here we see an example of an institution, the United States government, who has a great amount of impact and influence, setting a standard that uses race as a dividing factor between investment. And so as we move forward in the presentation, you'll see an example of how this practice was used in the field. So in the middle section here is the city of Dallas, and that's where I am. You'll see a color-coded map of the city in about 1937. So this is reflective of the rating that the housing department used during this time. And so A, of course, was the best rating you could receive, and D was the worst. And so you'll see A is going from green to red in different parts of the city. In the northern portion, you'll see more green areas. If there's white, it just wasn't settled yet, just not enough people in 1937. But when you see in the northeastern section of the map, it's green. And we'll show you on a slide currently what that still looks like today. And this is one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the Dallas area. This Highland Park and University Park, where the average home value is about 1.2 million, compared to the average home value in some of the Dallas census tracts just a little bit south of that average about 154,000. And that's today. But when we look at the two examples here on the left and right, you'll see an example of an A score. If you look at the bottom towards the right of each page, you'll see an A score on the left and a D score on the right. And then our A score, you see almost zero presence of racial minorities. And on the right, you see a very high percentage. You can also see the difference in home value from about $2,100 to $6,000 compared to $400 to $700 in value. And so with some of the comments at the bottom, you'll see them talking about race and concentration and whether or not a neighborhood is safe and stable based on the racial components. And again, these were not just opinions. These scores were used to determine investment in communities, whether that was the issuance of mortgages. If your federal services won't issue loans or mortgages, then people won't settle there and investment will be lacking. And those patterns are still present today. And we'll see that on the next slide with the new market tax credit map. If you see here in the southern sector, again, of the city, that red color, the yellow color, and you'll see at the top that in the right-hand corner where the legend is, that's showing you where the neighborhoods are severely distressed, where investment is needed. And so again, if you look at the northeastern section, you see it's grayed out because it's not eligible. That wealth is still present in those areas, and the patterns of disinvestment and lower incomes, lack of economic investment are still present in those same census tracts today. So when we think about equitable development, when we think about the purpose of new market tax credits and how they can begin to help these communities turn the corner, this is the type of longstanding and existing issues that we're facing. It's almost 100 years in between these maps, and they're almost identical.
There's a racial component that caused that historical disinvestment and is still at play today. And so to ignore that will perhaps prevent us from really achieving these goals of these investments. So thank you, Dr. Carter. Our next speaker, Dr. Iguf, led the country's largest collaborative group to assess fair housing and neighborhood disparities, recently secured a multi-year applied research partnership with Harvard University to test alternative delivery models of policy.
We are one of the largest housing authorities in the country, the fourth largest for the voucher program. And really our mission conventionally is to provide affordable housing for low to moderate income families. We operate two major programs. The first one is public housing. We own about 3,500 units, so we own and operate the units, so we act as a landlord. On the voucher side, we provide a subsidy for the tenant to lease in the private sector. And under the voucher program, we serve about 17,000 families. So what I'm going to do right now is just really focus on a couple maps and key findings that really have shaken the landscape of housing and affordable housing in Dallas and Texas in general. So, all right, that's a lot of maps, but I'm going to first talk about a very key metric when it comes to geographical inequity. Fair housing is RECAP. It's racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So this is a HUD metric that looks into racial and economic segregation. So a neighborhood that has an extreme poverty rate of at least 40%, which is astronomical, as well as a concentration of at least 50% of non-white residents will be designated as a recap. On the map, you have the city of Dallas from 1990 to 2016, which was the data that we had at the time of the assessment of fair housing. And the recaps are depicted in pink. We have observed a couple things. The first one is the persistence of racially and economically segregated neighborhoods in the southern sector, as well as the west side of Dallas, right? So a generation later, we still have some very strong persisting patterns of segregation. The second thing that we see is the number of recap neighborhoods have actually doubled. It's a lot of maps, but I'm just going to give you the synthesis of what needs to be thought about. So the first map that you see is really the overlay of voucher holders in recaps. So we were interested in knowing where voucher recipients are actually locating. And what we have found is that families that are actually assisted through the federal government disproportionately reside in racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So they live in the most segregated neighborhoods. The next map looks at accessibility to grocery stores as well as transportation, and those neighborhoods are depicted in green. And what we found is that not only housing trust voucher families are living in racially and economically segregated neighborhoods, but they also tend to not have access to transportation and healthy grocery stores. The next map is looking at the accessibility within a certain commute time via transit to well-paying jobs, which are characterized as jobs paying from around, I think, $3,300 and up. And what we can find again is that not only you live in a segregated neighborhood, low access to private transportation, low access to grocery store, but also you don't have access to jobs, right? The next step for us, we discussed the fact that, when your income goes up, your rent portion goes up, which may create more disincentive for voucher holders. So the next step that our office is going to take is to apply for a moving to work designation, which is the last arrow of the graph that you see on your screen. And that is pretty much a deregulation program run by the federal government that will allow us to test different ways of providing assistance. The way we are anticipating to develop a new way of making folks pay rent is actually not tied to your income going up and we're going to come and punish you on it. Is to actually have a market-based rent formula. So every year your rent will go up at a certain rate, depending on if you are in a high opportunity area, then the escalator is much smaller. If it's in a low opportunity area, your escalator is a bit higher, with the intent to create incentives to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods, but also not punish the family if an income increase is observed. So if you earn more, we're not going to come for the difference in the rent portion. So I really wanted to give you guys an overview of what we know of the landscape, some of those contradictory policies, and how, although we are steward of federal funds and we have to operate within the constraints of statutes and regulation, we've been able to navigate through policies to create a different system that would provide greater equities.
The low-income persons and communities we're trying to serve, they still, because of the challenges that Dr. Egoop described, may not have access to that job. Those are the considerations that I think her story can help shine some light for us. How can we approach new markets in the future and really use this tool within the lens of equitable development?
Thank you for that great segue. This definition has come from research that I've done and work that I've done in equitable development in the city of Dallas to help communities that are especially vulnerable to rapid turnover to better position themselves for the development that is coming, to put themselves in a position where they can benefit from the new additions to the community. This definition sees equitable development as a holistic approach. And I want you to think back to when we talked about banks saying they wouldn't issue a loan or back a loan or support a loan in a certain area. It started out with homes, but homes are connected to schools. Taxes that the school receives are based on the home that we live in. Schools often determines where people want to live, which can impact where retail locates, what jobs are nearby. Also entertainment. If you don't have a large enough base, it won't often be in the community, or even something as simple as a grocery store. And so the ripple effects of that one decision created holistic impact in a negative way. And so equitable development is coming back on the other side of that and saying, how can we create a holistically positive environment? and it looks at the overall well-being. So not just housing, not just economic development, saying how can we impact the community as a whole. And as we do that, to make sure that we're prioritizing the voices and the needs of those that are often left out of that discussion, especially communities of color who are often told what is coming and not involved in the process of creating a new solution or amenity. And here's just some quick things to think about when you're considering how you could measure your success through equitable development. So if you're looking at workforce, look at, the number of jobs that are increased as a result of your project. And in that, not just the number of jobs, but how many local residents have been involved in that project through hiring? How many of them have received jobs that are at or above a living wage? And then long term, you want to look at some changes in the income. So if the census tract started out with AMI of 25,000, and your project's been there over 3 years, has that increased any? Has it moved up to 28,000 or 30,000 to see if the overall financial well-being of the community has increased? You can also look at new businesses established. And then with education, has the graduation rate increased? More diverse educational programming been put into place? Also looking at truancy rate. Are students interested in coming and staying in school because of the diverse programming? Healthcare, look at a comparison between the increase in preventative care visits to emergency room visits, which are often a last resort for people who don't have a primary health care provider. And then community accountability, thinking about regular meetings with the community and with the residents, again, to make sure that they stay on board with you, possibly a steering committee that could help you with outlining and determining key pain points in the community that your project could address. This is just a sample to get you started and have some ideas of what your metrics could be and what you could measure to seek success in a different way outside of just dollars and cents.
Moving on to our next speaker, really excited to have Jennifer Westerbeck with us.
Looking at our USBD CDC strategy, really believe that racial equity crosses party lines. One indicator, for example, is that New Markets Tax Credit is very much supported by both Democrats and Republicans. It is supported because it is really trying to figure out what the community itself needs and then making those investments that are brought to us from the community. This is a recent commitment that we made bank-wide, a $116 million commitment to address racial inequities. This year specifically, we committed $19 million of our allocation to Black-led projects. And it is also shaping the way that we do investments just with any allocatee. We have begun to decline deals solely on the basis of our racial equity or inequity analysis. One of the things I pointed out was this crosses political lines. When you start to dig deeper into the policies that are disproportionately impacting people of color, you also are seeing that the general upward mobility in this country is impacting everyone. To say that it's going to benefit some population versus another is simply, in our perspective, not true. If you address these inequities, then everyone benefits.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next up, we're going to hear about specific projects from Shamika Chladni of Enterprise. Shamika, thanks so much for being with us.
So when I think about sort of how to think about equity when it comes to NMTC investments, I thought maybe the 4 W's would be a good way to talk about it. I have 4 W's here because I think we all understand the why. And if you didn't understand the why, I think the previous panelists already drove those points home. So we'll just focus on the other ones. So for Enterprise and the way we look at our new markets investments, I think one of the biggest things we can do is select partners who are as committed to the equity work as we are, especially since as a national CDE with a small team, we can't be in every place as often as we'd want to be. So we're really relying on our investment partners to do the day-to-day execution of what we've all envisioned when we make those investments. We estimate that we see about 200 transactions a year. And we're going to invest in probably 6 transactions, let's say in the second half of 2020 and the first half of 2021. That means that we can be selective about what projects we choose to do and who we choose to work with. One of the things that attracted us to this food hall investment in Baltimore, this is a historic market in Baltimore that had been around since, I believe, the late 1700s. So there was an understanding, although not solid proof, that at one time this market, in addition to serving produce and other things, was also a slave market for the city of Baltimore. So it was really important to this community that the sort of reinvigoration of this market included Black and brown vendors. And our developer shared that vision. But not only was that an articulated part of what we all wanted to do, there were two things that were being done to help bring that vision to fruition. One of which was a selection committee comprised of a bunch of different community members, people with restaurant experience and people without restaurant experience, to help come up with what the selection criteria would be for new vendors who were interested in being in that market, so that there was a panel who would decide who the vendors were going to be, to sort of help take some of the bias out of that process and get people comfortable that it was a fair process. The second thing that they had set up for that investment was sort of a mentorship program, if you will, for potential vendors, especially first-time vendors, with other established restaurateurs to help them figure out the financing that they would need to generate in order to open a new physical location, how to think about staffing up, how to think about suppliers, and those types of things to really get those first-time, in many cases, minority developers up to speed on how to be successful when the market opens. So for us, having those sort of extra parts of the deal that had already been thought about or that we could help scope with the developers are the kinds of things that make us excited about being an investment and help us, to the extent that we can, get more confidence that the community benefits that we are trying to achieve are more likely to happen. For the what, the articulation of community benefits, most folks, I think, who are a part of this call understand the community benefits agreements that we all have. Just really fleshing out those benefits and making them tailored to your specific deals and the things that you expect to happen in those deals. So for example, we worked on a project that had retail spaces in Detroit, and there was a commitment that at least 60% of the spaces would be for local businesses, and they would be offered rents 50% below market. So articulating in the community benefits agreement, if not exactly which units those are going to be, the square footage, what the rent was going to be offered, and how we would track those things along the way is something that if you just dig, we find that digging a little bit deeper helps us to make sure we're all on the same page going into the transaction, and makes it easier for us to follow up, frankly, for lack of a better way of saying it, with a developer. For that particular project, we have a monthly leasing call with them to just sort of figure out where they are on track with that. When? So I think a lot of us think about things like set-asides for specific types of businesses during the construction phase. One thing that we saw recently that we hope to sort of replicate in more of our projects is thinking about the entire continuum of the real estate transaction. So in a recent CBA with a developer and a philanthropic partner, they had specific goals for local business enterprise participation, minority business enterprise participation, and women-owned business enterprise participation, both during the pre-development phase, during construction, and then leasing targets for the different businesses, or which percentage of those businesses was minority-owned or female-owned, and also just the ongoing operations for those businesses, asking those tenants to think about things like partnering with local workforce training programs to find new hires, looking for new hires that were in the neighborhood as opposed to bringing through people in from outside the neighborhood, and those types of things. There are literally benchmarks for what the average salaries would be, sort of really dove deep into how to think about how we can make an equitable development in each part of the phase of that project. And then the last thing that we think about is how equity is contextual when you're talking about the geography of a place. When we are thinking about equity for our projects, we're not only thinking about racial equity, although that is important. Depending on the project, there might be different things that are also important. For example, a project in Miami that we're looking at investing in, we just wanted to ensure that they are offering their services in multiple languages, including Spanish and Creole, which they already are. But if they weren't, just by asking that question, I think it helps us to filter through what projects might be offering services to people in the communities they're in, and what projects might just be sort of physically located in that community, but not really offering services to the people that live there.
thank you, Shamika. It was an incredible closing discussion, and I think the practical examples really helps us bring these topics home. To summarize for all of you, we all recommend that you do some kind of internal reflection and training process. 2, really recommend that you try to set up your own impact management system. Reflect upon your services. How are you creating more equity in the world through these new markets investments? What can you do to revise some of those processes to ensure greater equity? And then 3, every deal truly is unique, and you may need help and support looking at, again, the holistic nature of the deal, right? Because we're so siloed in society, no matter where we're working. And how can we really try to bring a more holistic approach to these things? If you are interested in exploring ways to how we can continue this conversation, continue developing strategies and deepening our understanding together, please sign up for an appointment. We could talk with you further, and don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions. Thank the speakers again. Thank you for what you do. And if anyone wants to stay on and chat a little bit more, feel free.